All right, so we're actually recording right now. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to a scholar in the field of archaeology and history, Dr. Daniel Fleming. He's currently a professor at NYU, and he's on a sabbatical, of course, taking a break in this time period. But I do want to introduce the world to a man that I've read two of his books. I'm on the third book now. He's a great mind, and I think he has a lot to offer the community as far as proper understanding within the context of the biblical stories and how we look at them. So I think, Dr. Fleming, man, nice to meet you. This is the first time we're conversating, but I want to say it's an honor to actually meet you, put a face to the writings.
No, it's
How are you
it's
doing
a
today?
pleasure. It's a pleasure. So, and yeah, I am on sabbatical leave, which is a chance to start more research. In fact, I wrote my dissertation on this site called Emar, which is the most technical book in a way of the ones that you put your hands on. And this was the second book in that project. And then I put it aside so that I could work on other things and not be so narrowly, identified with one ancient site. But I've come back to the site, and in fact, the book I'm working on now is once again on that site. So it's with
Let me
the
ask you a
leave, but
question.
it's nice to talk. Go
Let
ahead.
me ask you a question. What were you before you started studying and going to colleges and so forth? What were you into? Was your family into this stuff? What got you into Assyriology and all that type of stuff?
So I am the son of a mathematician and kind of had science in the family and thought that that was almost the family business. And yet I just wasn't interested in the same kind of things that my father was. And so I ended up as an undergraduate being a geology major. And at the same time, while I was in college, I became a Christian out of a completely non-religious family. So kind of the opposite direction, as sometimes happens to people with education, that I came to a Christian faith at the same time as I was beginning my more serious education. And so I worked for 3 years in geology after finishing college, and then thought that I wanted to study the Bible. It had been particularly exciting to me. It had been that with all the shouting voices saying, you should believe this, you should believe this. The Bible became a way to say, okay, this is what Christianity is based on. I'm going to use that as my judge in a way. And so I went to a seminary to start studying the Bible. But when I told them that I was interested in teaching, though I had no idea what that would mean,
Mm-hmm.
my advisor said, well, you should get more serious training in ancient languages. And he sent me to Harvard to study what's called Akkadian, the language of ancient Babylon, with the PhD students at Harvard. And I loved it. Like I didn't even know this language existed. It's what Hammurabi's code is written in, which is what sixth graders learn about ancient history.
Right.
And so from that moment, I guess I wanted to go to graduate school to get a PhD that would focus on what for Christians is the Old Testament and for Jews is just the Bible. And yet I was so excited about this other ancient language of Babylon that I was starting to learn that I decided I wanted to combine what's called Assyriology, which is the study of these texts. And so I ended up going to Harvard to get my PhD and ended up really working in both and becoming a kind of historian of not just ancient Israel, but the larger world around it. And so you can see that I've written books that have nothing to do with Israel or the Bible, like the one on Emar. But I've written 2 books, those are the 2 you've put your hands on. The one called The Legacy of Israel and Judah's Bible, which was my basic attempt to kind of put out there for the larger world what I think about how to relate the Bible to history. And then the second book just came out a month ago, and is my attempt to explain in a really new way the first things that can be known about the special God of Israel, whose name is Yahweh.
All right. What's you sent me an article through email when we had a written conversation about the lost tribes, and you basically, like it was a beautiful article, by the way. I agree with everything that you wrote. Can you explain your point of view as far as Israel before the 12 tribes concept? Can you explain what Israel was like in the before the Iron Age?
So again, without knowing your audience and trying to, I'll think about it as teaching undergraduates in a sense. I mean, smart people who can really follow an argument, but may not have the background, like to know a lot of the details. And you can stop me or ask more questions if I've missed anything. So the thing that's essential to relating the Bible to history, and that is not something, it's not what is ordinarily taught in churches or synagogues. It's just not relevant to the average person of faith, is the layeredness of how the Bible was written. And even if you think about what the Bible is, it's got all these different books. And now let's speak of the Old Testament, or what scholars call the Hebrew Bible, the Bible in Hebrew. It's got, what is it? It's 39 books, something like that, depending on how you count. And if you think it's got books of Moses, it's got then more history books that are called Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. It's got books associated with prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah. It's got the book of Psalms. It's got the book of Proverbs and all these other littler books. And so already the Bible feels like a collection. But what people often don't think about is how those books were combined, but even how each individual book could have been put together. And one example that I've given to students of faith is the book of Kings, it's now divided into two, although in Greek, there are 4 books of Kings. So the 2 books of Samuel and the 2 books of Kings are called 1, 2, 3, and 4 Kings. And those begin with Saul and David, the first kings of Israel, and then bring you to Solomon, who begins what's now for us called the first book of Kings. And then those books continue until first the kingdom of Israel. Well, so what's understood by the Bible as a single people called Israel is portrayed as splitting into 2 kingdoms. And this happens right after the death of King Solomon, the son of David. And from the time of those first kings after Solomon to 720 for the northern kingdom called Israel, and 586 for the southern kingdom called Judah, there were 2 kingdoms living side by side. And then first one people and then the other was conquered by an outside imperial power. First the kingdom of Assyria and then the kingdom of Babylon, both of which would be based in modern Iraq. And so if you think about those books of Kings and you approach the Bible the way normal people would, to think, well, okay, it's the Bible, it's the word of God, it should all be written in the same moment. Well, in the book of Kings, that moment would have to be after the destruction of the second kingdom of Judah in the 500s BCE. And the date of Solomon would be in the 10th century, so sometime in the 900s, maybe 350 to 400 years earlier. So here we have one biblical book that presents us with a choice. Either it's written all at once, the way books might be traditionally understood, in which case it would almost have to just make up the stuff about the early days, about Solomon, right? Because if it's written in the 500s and Solomon was 400 years earlier, then what can it know if it was all written at the same time? And so even from that point of view, someone who thinks the Bible might remember something of history would want it to have been written in a layered way so that it could have used sources that were older. Now, in fact, it's often not so convenient as that. You can ask, well, if Moses or Joshua or even Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are even farther back in the past, then when were those books written? And scholars, based on the nature of the language and the ways in which the stories are combined and the connections between them, would generally understand the oldest texts that are in something close to the form they were first written in might be from the 9th century. This would be the 800s. So they would already be hundreds of years after the time of a Moses or a Joshua, and even longer, after the time of the ancestors of Genesis. And so I'm just saying that for anything else I say about the relationship of the Bible to history and names to history to make sense, then the people who are listening to us, have to kind of at least try out the road of thinking about the Bible as written in this layered way, where it's stories about the ancestors, and it's stories about the people coming out of Egypt, and it's stories about Joshua, and it's stories about life in the land before kings, would have only been written down hundreds of years after what's portrayed. And then this raises all sorts of questions about what they knew, like how much of it was kind of piecing together legends and how much was based on some sort of sources and what those sources knew. So there's the sort of foundation to everything, and it might be more than you want, but it's just to say that nothing else I say about what I think about the tribes in Israel will make sense unless the people listening to us are willing to try out this notion that the writing of the Bible is layered, and the oldest writing that we have in the Bible probably goes back to the 800s BCE, before Christ. So then, I mean, the question is, when, for instance, one of the things the Bible says is that there was, that if you had to choose one primary name for the people of God, the people of the Bible, the people that the Bible cares about, it would be Israel. And in fact, one of the intriguing things is this is the Jewish Bible. And in Hebrew, the word Jew, you could say, is, well, what would be the best way to put this? I mean, the word for Judah is Yehudah, and the word for the language would be Yehudit. You can hear even how the name Jew comes from this. The people, the Jewish people and Judaism are the survivors of the kingdom of Judah, which was the southern of these kingdoms, not of Israel. And so the reason that I called my second, the middle book that you had read, The Legacy of Israel in Judah's Bible, is because the Jews are the people of Judah, and they have laid claim to the whole heritage of Israel. And in Genesis, Judah is explained as one of the tribes, one of 12 tribes of Israel. And so when it comes to talking about the Iron Age, then I guess my starting point would be these two kingdoms that we have a pretty good hold on, both for certain biblical evidence and also the small amount of non-biblical writing that we have for that period. It's clear anybody would agree that there were these two kingdoms, that the southern one had the capital at Jerusalem and was called Judah, at least eventually. It might have been called something else earlier. There's a famous text that was discovered in northern modern Israel that's called the Tel Dan inscription, D-A-N, like my name. And I don't know if you've heard of it, but it was famous because it had a reference to what's called the House of David. But what's interesting is that the House of David is not used as a name for the king. It's used as a name for the kingdom. So instead of saying there's Israel and Judah, it says there's Israel and the House of David. So that's a kind of starting point for thinking about what there is in the Iron Age, the second half of the Iron Age. So then the question is, what could there have been before that? And there is one famous text from Egypt that uses the name Israel going all the way back to about 1200. And so even outside the Bible, it's clear that the name of Israel did exist and was somewhere in that land, though we don't know how big or what kind of government it had. And so along with another scholar that you might be interested in talking to, if you could get a hold of her, named Lauren Monroe from Cornell University, she and I have been working on trying to figure out how the Bible can help us understand the earliest names associated with Israel. And this is where it gets difficult, because the complete list of 12 tribes and the notion that they were all associated with the sons of Jacob is part of the kind of finished scheme of biblical writing. And it's built from texts that did not include all 12 tribes. And so these were kind of massaged in order to produce a consistent text. And one of the sources that Lauren Monroe and I rely on more than any, and which I talk about in both of these two books, is Judges chapter 5. And this text is usually called the Song of Deborah. It's in poetry. Its vision of Israel, and it does use the name, is independent of what you might find in Genesis or Joshua. It does not, it has a bunch of the same names that appear as tribes, but it doesn't call them the tribes of Israel, and it's missing 2 or 3 important ones, and gives a different name for 2 of them. And so in this article that I sent you, Lauren Monroe and I talk a bit about what we think is possible to imagine for the early groups within Israel related to Israel. And so we would be saying that the names of the groups that came to be thought of as tribes of Israel are indeed very, very old, and would go back to the early Iron Age, the time when Israel did exist. But it's not even clear that all of those named groups would have considered themselves part of Israel. And I think it's likely that in their early days, they did not think of themselves as part of Israel. They were more allies.
Dr. Fleming, would you agree that the folks who eventually came into being Israelites, most of them worship the god El first? Would you agree with that?
So partly yes. And so this is where, when you read my most recent book, then I will address this directly. And so the problem with the question is, who is Israel when you're back in, say, 1200, when the name Israel is mentioned in a text from one of the Egyptian kings? And so it's clear that something called Israel existed then. And even the name in Hebrew is Yisra-El, which means something like may El struggle, and El means God or the God. And I do think, in agreement with Mark Smith, my colleague and friend who for a year taught with me at NYU, he's one of the first people who really advocated the idea that the first God of Israel was El. And one of the reasons was the name. And in the end, after many years of not being sure, I decided that he's right. He'll be glad to hear that, but right. He already knows. But the thing that's interesting is that where it's very natural to look at groups like, I don't know, I mean, go down the list of tribal names like Dan and Naphtali and Issachar and Asher and to think, okay, these are part of Israel. But at the time when the Egyptians wrote about Israel in 1200, I think it's most likely that those groups were not part of Israel. And so even though the people that call themselves Israel were a smaller group. Like, so they must have been substantial, and they probably occupied a central part of maybe the more northern and central part of what's now modern Israel. But they it's hard to know what gods they may have worshipped, but it appears they identified themselves especially with a god named the God, or El, while these other neighboring and sometimes allied peoples also may or may not have worshipped El, but may have been among the first peoples to identify themselves more directly with Yahweh, who would have been, it's another name, and originally would have been approached as a separate god.
Okay. I have your book open, and the book, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is Yahweh Before Israel, and it's a good read. If you're the conversation we're about to have is based off of this book. In the first chapter, you give an introduction, the search for Yahweh's origin, the Midianite hypothesis, the rebuilding from old materials. Then in the second chapter, you go into Yahweh of the Shasu. Was that the first reference that you found of Yahweh in history since you've been searching about this?
Absolutely. The thing is that in writing this book, this was not based on new archaeological finds or something. This was not based on some piece of evidence that I discovered that no one else been aware of.
Right.
I'm a teacher both of undergraduates, but I also have PhD students, and I'm working at a very advanced level with these students who themselves are trying to understand both the Bible, its relation to history, religion. And so it's through that teaching especially that I realized that there was something wrong with the interpretation that was the most common and the most believable. And as the deeper I probed, just to reevaluate the evidence that everyone had already acknowledged, I began to distrust the interpretation. And the farther I went, the more I realized that there were much better explanations available that in fact no one had proposed. And so for a long time, it's been known that, and when I say a long time, the first piece of evidence was discovered in the 1940s, and then the rest in the 1960s. So, that's not really recent, but in scholarly terms, it's, a while ago. And so it was discovered that in two different related lists that were found on ancient Egyptian temples, one of which is from something close to about 1400 BCE. So this is really old, right? Before the kingdoms, before the name Israel is even known. And then there's another kind of partial copy and adjusted version of the same list on a temple from a pharaoh named Ramses II, who's pretty famous because he left huge statues of himself all over Egypt that are now, in museums and archaeological sites around Egypt. And so these references to the name Yahweh are older than anything that could be written in the Bible by far. And the next oldest non-biblical reference to the name is from the 9th century, one of the references to the kingdom of Israel, the Moabite Mesha inscription.
Right.
And so it is indeed by far the oldest reference. Now, the thing that's really important is that it is almost certainly the name, almost all scholars agree that it is the same name, but it is not a reference to a god. And so then the challenge is, well, then what is it? if it's not a reference,
Hold on, Dr. Fleming. What reference are you talking about? Which specific one?
so I'm speaking of these, again, there are two temples in Egypt, one from...
Oh, the ones in Egypt. You're talking about...
Yeah, these are the ones in Egypt. So if you go back to the ones in Egypt, which are hundreds of years older than any other, hundreds of years older than anything outside the Bible, and probably hundreds of years older than anything inside the Bible. And yet, so the thing that's crucial to understand is that the name Yahweh in Hebrew is spelled with what in English would be the letters YHW, and then the last H is a vowel letter. And these are very particular letters. They're not just any old spelling you could use for anything. And the Egyptian writing system also is based on, I mean, in fact, we now know in the last 20 years that the alphabet, the alphabet that we now use even, was invented in Egypt by people who spoke something closer to Hebrew, but older. And so it's no accident that the Egyptians had the ability to write the same sounds that Hebrew used. And so it's just to say that when we see these letters written the way they are in Egyptian, it's exactly the right spelling to represent the name of what comes to be Israel's God. And yet it is not a God. Like, so in 1380 or whatever it is, at this place called Soleb, which is a temple or a city with a temple that's now in Sudan, actually, south of Egypt, built by the Egyptians, it is not a God. And so that chapter 2 that you're asking about is really central to my whole book, because what I propose that's new is that it was the name for a people. And the word Shasu, which I write as Shasu, was the Egyptians' name for like Bedouin. It was nomads, it was people who lived in the backcountry that was in the direction of Israel. Also, in a way, you could say the direction of the Sinai Peninsula, of Seir and Edom, but also that lived all the way up through Jordan, the modern country of Jordan, even through the kind of desert backcountry of Syria. This is what they called those people, Shasu. And this text says that the Egyptians were dominant over those people. And they give specific names, and who knows how they had these names of those subdivisions of the Shasu people. And one of them is named Yahweh.
Wow. So very interesting. With this information now, as I told you before about my book and everything, so let's move on to, so how, you know what? Let me follow up by asking you this then. How did Yahweh get to the Israelites then? How did Yahweh as a God get to the Israelites? Because the Misha Steel, Dr. Richard Hess did actually say the same thing you said. We found the reference to Yahweh in the that's the oldest reference outside of Exodus, I am that I am, that they found. So how did Yahweh get to the Israelites if some of them were worshiping El? We don't know who was worshiping Yahweh eventually, but how did it get to be the Israelite God? We know Deuteronomy 32:8-9 breaks it down as far as Yahweh. Mark Smith wrote about this also. How did they get it from what you found in archaeology?
So I'll add a question to your question, just what you need more patience, which is the first question is how the name of a people got to be the name of a God. And so in a way, that the problem or the big donut hole or something in the middle of my whole book is that problem. And I acknowledge from the start that there is no answer. Like we simply don't know the answer. But I propose, first of all, that it has to be true, that if the the name Yahweh is not just a common name that's used for lots of things. I mean, it's a very, very rare word. It is only known as the God of Israel later. And this evidence from the Egyptian temple is the only place that names a people by that name. So how do you get from one to the other? They have to be the same name. In fact, I mean, it'd be one thing if this was the name of, some city in Egypt along the Nile. I mean, something totally unrelated. But in fact, they themselves are saying, oh, this is a name of a people that's not from Egypt. It's from the direction of what became Israel. Like it's the right place. And not only that, the Bible, for one, is full of the notion that the people of Israel did not begin as city dwellers and farmers and village people. They began as herding people with sheep and goats and nomads who moved from place to place and lived in tents. And that idea is sprinkled through the Bible stories about how Israel began. And so when you find that the Egyptians know the name Yahweh and they associate the name Yahweh with just those same kinds of people in just that sort of place, maybe more broadly, but still the right place for what will end up being related to Israel, they have to go together. That's what's first most important. So what I propose as a possible way in which this could happen comes from a particular phrase that's actually quite rare to the Bible, but that occurs twice in the Song of Deborah. And this is the phrase that in English would be the people of Yahweh. And in Hebrew, it's the two words are which is people, and then after that would be Yahweh, although if you're Jewish, you wouldn't pronounce it out of respect. But side by side, they would even mean the people Yahweh. And so it's a short.
Wow. Where in Judges is this? Which verse?
It's Judges 5. The oldest version is in Judges 5, verse 13. Mm-hmm. Then what I've proposed, and Mark Smith also thinks this is true, with sort of a number of people we've worked with and talked to agree. It's still a very debated sort of question, but I would argue that the verse 13 is the oldest version in the poem, and that the introductory hymn at the beginning of the Song of Deborah was added later, and that verse 11 is part of that addition. So yes.
Yes. That's very interesting, Doc. That's very go ahead.
But this is just to say that what I'm imagining with this very, very old phrase in mind, and part of my new book is arguing that phrase, the people of Yahweh, existed without connection to Israel, that the people who fought against the Canaanites in the Song of Deborah were allying themselves, were unified as the people of Yahweh, not as Israel. Mm-hmm. All the references to Israel in the poem come earlier in the first 10 verses. And so what I'm imagining is that the God Yahweh was in some way kind of the embodiment of the people. Like the people had the same name as their God, however that worked. And we know that the most famous example that's like this, although it's a very different kind of situation. So if you've heard of the Assyrian Empire, they're the first great empire that conquered the Middle East.
Right.
The ones that put an end to the kingdom of Israel.
Yeah, from the 900 BC.
Yeah,
right.
But in 720, that was when they finally defeated Israel and brought the kingdom to an end. And so the Assyrians are named for their capital, which is the city of Ashur. Mm-hmm. And the god of Ashur, the city, and Assyria was named Ashur. Like that. So there was no separate name. Like if you said Ashur out loud and you lived in that city or in that kingdom, you would not know whether you meant the people or the god.
Wow. You know, Doc, let me stop you for a second. It's getting hot
Yeah,
in here. That's a
yeah.
very interesting point. So, would you now say that Judges 5:13, referring to the people of Yahweh, was referring to a place that the people were?
It's totally a good question. It's exactly the right question.
Mm,
I would say that in that context, it is definitely the God. And one of the reasons you can see that, and this now goes to the current work of my colleague friend Lauren Monroe, who I mentioned before, with whom I wrote this article that I sent you. She's working on the Song of Deborah, a kind of historical reading of the Song of Deborah. And
mhm,
she's argued very persuasively that the original poem that was about a battle fought by the gathered people of Yahweh began in verse 12 when it calls for Deborah and Barak to arise, and went to verse 23 where all the people who failed to join the battle are cursed in the name of Yahweh. And cursing in the name of Yahweh is something you do with a God, like not of people.
exactly.
There's no question we're talking about a God. And yet, so that would mean that the name of the God is very old as a God. But I would still be saying that, I mean, I guess I'd say that if you go all the way back to the Yahweh of the Shasu as a people, it's impossible to know whether in that early time, Yahweh could also have been the name of a God, just like at Ashur, that you'd have a God and a people with the same name. But I'm saying that at some point before the Mesha inscription reference that Richard Hess brought to your attention, and before, I actually think that the core, what I call battle account in the Song of Deborah in Judges 5 is older than the 9th century. I think it's very old because it has to do with an alliance of peoples before there were kings. There's no northern kingdom of Israel. There's no southern kingdom of Judah. There's no reference to Judah or Jerusalem. I mean, this battle account it belongs in the time of Judges, if you say. It belongs in a time when there were not yet kings, whenever exactly that was. But I think it's very, very old, maybe something like the 11th century.
Yeah, a lot of people dated to the 11th century or even early 12th century.
But again,
Mhm.
people who date it that early are dating the whole Song of Deborah that early. And so I would argue that the song was revised to kind of reread the people of Yahweh as Israel. And the most logical time when that would have been done was when the kingdom of Israel was becoming a large, powerful, entity that included those tribes, all of those groups as tribes. And I think that was probably in the 9th century.
But that's pretty interesting because if it's the 9th century, the additions or the redactions took place to the storyline, it still didn't include some major tribes that we see later on in the story, going back to
Yeah,
the earlier point.
that's right. I mean, one of the things, if you start thinking in terms of the 9th century, that's interesting is that in the Mesha text, this is the oldest non-biblical reference to Yahweh as a God. There is actually, absolutely, there's reference to Israel. It's the people called Moab are fighting against people called Israel. Although it's interesting, it's never some great war between all the armies of Israel and the armies of Moab. Moab attacks certain large towns, fortified towns that were associated with Israel and capture them. And they set up the text to boast about having captured maybe 4 of these towns that were very close to Moab in what's modern Jordan, like far, far away from most of the kingdom of Israel. But one of those towns was associated with a people called Gad, Gad. And Gad is one of the tribes of Israel, if you go back and you look at your list. And yet, the Mesha text says that the people of Gad were there, it says, from of old. In fact, you could even translate it since forever, like
Right.
time gone by. And it gives the impression that the people of Gad have been there before Moab before Israel, like they were just their own people.
Let me tell you, let me cut you off
Yeah,
for 1 second
go
and tell you
ahead.
what I observed about the Misha Steel, reading it from an English perspective.
Yeah,
God has nothing to do with Israel, in my just reading it. They seem like two separate entities, and he's destroyed, according to their storyline, of course, they destroyed the men of Israel, but they didn't destroy the men of God, and they put them in that region again. That goes back to the biblical geography of where GAD is, because we did find the dictionary of deities with Lester Grab and Carl Toon and all of them. It talks about God was like a god of luck, and he's referred to in Isaiah 65:11. And that God, you see the theophoric names for the people who wore the name God, just like how you spoke about Ashur and you spoke about the Yahweh people in Judges 5:13. The same thing with God. So all of this is you're blowing my mind right now.
actually,
I'm piecing it
I
together.
actually like that idea. I
Yeah.
hadn't. I mean,
Mhm.
I know. So there's a city called Palmyra in modern Syria, uh,
Right.
that is out in the middle of the desert, and it's very ancient as a kind of merchant. I don't know. It's like a caravan city or something where if you went through Palmyra, it would be a kind of shortcut between Jordan and Damascus and what's now Iraq. And so it's texts, especially from Palmyra, that attest to a god named Gad, Gad. And I did not think of that to put in my book as a possible, thank you very much. Too late. No, as I mean, that if I was looking for, it's just funny. One of my current students, was pushing me to try to find an example that would be tribal, as unlike Ashur, which is a city. And I did find some very, very interesting evidence from South Arabia, from Yemen.
Right.
But in fact, your idea about Gad, although the notion that Gad is a god,
I'll give you that one for free. I'll give you that
thank you
one for
very
free.
much. Yeah. So but it's that idea, the evidence for it being a god is fairly late. This is almost Roman times,
Mhm.
hundreds of years later. But if Gad was already a god back in the time when it was a people, like in Mesha, then it would be another example of what I'm talking about. And your off the cuff impression, like just trying to be. It's funny. This sounds like it's not a respectful term, but this is like one of the best compliments you can get as a reader, is to be said that your reading is innocent. And what it means is that it's not prejudiced, that you're just reading straight from what's there. And in a way, when you said, okay, you're just reading the English, but you're trying to understand just what's there, your reading,
Exactly.
I think, is right on target, because in reading it just straight, I think you're seeing what's there, which is that the people of God in that text are not understood to be part of Israel. They're understood to be friendly with Israel, which is how one of their towns ended up ruled by Israel. And
Right.
like you say, but the interesting thing in connection with the Song of Deborah is that Gad is one of the names that is left out of that alliance in the Song of Deborah, and it's replaced, or at least the other name that's in there instead.
Gilead or Mashiach.
Yeah, Gilead. It's Gilead. Yeah. And so, or in Hebrew, it's Gilad, but Gilead. And so that's a good question. I mean, you could conclude from that the particular people of Gad, at least, I mean, they're not part of that alliance.
Yeah, because if you look at it, I look at the whole confederacy conversation. Like Israel became like a confederacy where all these people merge, and then later on, someone changed the story from a Judean Deuteronomic perspective. That's how I look at it as a baseline. A lot. I mean, it's the Bible has a lot of things in it you could use, but I mean, if you're taking it from a literal perspective, you're going to run into problems. You're going to run into serious problems if you say, I mean, as a believer, you say it's a word of God, but as an archaeologist, you have to look at what the evidence presents. How does that work for you, though? As far as you're looking at the Bible as a text, and you're an Assyriologist, and you're trying to look for evidence, and how does it work for you? And as far as teaching your students?
So one of the things that I learned very on in my education studying the Bible, and that I believe is the best rule, whether you're a college freshman or a person in a church or a synagogue or a person like you, wherever you might be, who just wants to know, is to let each passage of the Bible speak for itself. And this, in fact, I think is the foundation of the best preaching, to let the Bible speak instead of trying to force an idea that you already have about what it should say onto it. And sometimes what happens, and this can happen as much with archaeologists and historians as with people preaching, is that they think they know the big picture. They already know what Israel is, and they already know who God is, more or less. And they know what the story is of who came from where and who's allied with whom, and when the kings got started and how they split, and they know that story. And so when they get to an individual story in the Bible that is actually not acting as if that large story existed, and this is true, in fact, if you get to this Song of Deborah. Like in the Song of Deborah, you would not know there was a people of Judah. What they talk about, even when the whole finished song, they talk about Israel and they talk about the people of Yahweh. They never even mention the people of Judah, tribe of Judah. And it's clear that they want to talk about everybody because they're cursing the ones who didn't show up. They have a list of 4 groups.
You're right. They mentioned, I think, 4 tribes that didn't
come
show up. Yep.
And so Judah's not even on the list of the bad guys, like for not showing up. And so you could read this poem and think, well, yeah, but I mean, Judah was just too far south. They were, preoccupied with something else. They couldn't be bothered, so they aren't even mentioned. But if you just read it, you just let it speak for itself, what it's giving you is a time, a point of view when, if you were talking about Israel, Judah was irrelevant. Like it was just not part of the picture. It could have existed, but it was in no way related to Israel, so far as that story would tell you. So as a historian, a serious reader of the Bible, a reader of a lot of evidence from outside the Bible, whether it be from Hebrew or other related like Moabite inscriptions or in Akkadian language, I try to let each piece of evidence speak for itself. Just as when you were saying that your reaction to the Mesha inscription was God is a people on its own, you're letting that text just speak for itself. You're not saying, oh, well, it's got to fit this way with something I know from the Bible or something I know from somewhere else. And that's what I try to do. And it's what I try to teach students to do at every level. And I also let people be themselves. I don't try in my courses and in my larger teaching to take people of faith, whether they're Jewish, whether they're Christian, they could be Muslim or something else. I don't try to force them to give up their belief. I try to teach them to, for one, since the Bible for these conversations is the point of reference, I try to get people to read each text and let it say what it's saying with the point that it has. And then they can work to try to figure out how this text might relate to that text. And in fact, I actually think that a Bible that compiled the best that these people could know, like that, sometimes it was just traditions, sometimes it was older texts, and they try to piece them together into larger texts that would make sense together. And they were doing it in all good faith, like trying to save for their people the best memories, the best interpretations of the past that they could come up with. And yet, they're so far from the actual past they're trying to describe. And as historians today, I mean, we can check what they know and what they don't know. And
Right.
usually what I find is that people of all sorts of backgrounds will join me in this, knowing that I'm not trying to force them, to agree with me, because we can all get together in a classroom, in a conversation, and start talking about what we see in the evidence in front of us.
Beautiful. And again, ladies and gentlemen, the book is called Yahweh Before Israel. It was released like a month or two ago. From what I've read so far, it's a beautiful book. I noticed chapter 6, you went into chapter 6, the people of Yahweh. I find that very interesting, just looking at what it's about. So I'm going to finish that book soon. But let's go to a book that's very confusing, ladies and gentlemen. I have no problem saying it's confusing, but it's a beautiful book. Time at Emar, the cultic calendar and the rituals from the diviner's house. How I found out about this book was my studies about the origins of Passover. So this led me, and I'm sure Dr. Hess, by using the information, thought that it was well worthy to put in his book. And I thought the information was mine. It just blew my mind that it's a possibility there was someone following a ritual that was extremely similar to the one in the Bible. It's like it's almost, in some instances, it's like they copied it, like, oh, we're gonna put this in the Bible. How did you feel writing the book and finding out this information, seeing that you know so much about the Bible?
Well, it was just a lot of fun. One of the things about being a biblical scholar, which is part of what I do, but not the whole thing, is that you're studying writings that have been read by millions and probably billions of people over the ages, that have been studied by thousands, at least, by thousands of very learned people. And so even though the questions are always changing and there are always new things to understand, you are always looking over someone else's shoulder. So when I was a PhD student in the 1980s, the text from this site that is on the Euphrates River, the very kind of furthest west toward part of the Euphrates River, toward Lebanon and toward the Mediterranean Sea, there had been the discovery of a new archaeological site. They were building a dam. And so this was one of the places they knew was a city of some kind. They didn't know exactly what. They thought that it might be a city called Emar or Emar that was known from a few other texts. And in fact, they started finding Akkadian writing when they excavated there. And it did turn out that that was the name of the place. And the texts were from what's called the Late Bronze Age. It's something like the 13th century, the same time as Ramses II of Egypt that I mentioned before. And the texts were published right as I was taking courses as a PhD student. And my advisor asked if I'd like to read some of these together with him. It was only me. I was taking a course. It was only me and my advisor and another professor. It was pretty intimidating. And he said, okay, let's just read, you read and we'll talk. So I had to translate them and I prepared them for class, and then they commented. And at some point, my advisor said, he looked at me and said, well, you're interested in the Bible. Why aren't biblical scholars reading these? And I said, they're so new, like nobody even knows they exist. And so I realized that this would be the most exciting topic for my PhD dissertation, the book that you have to write as a PhD student. And so, in fact, I was the first person ever to study the ritual texts from this site. And they had descriptions of rituals that were unlike anything known from the world at all, from the ancient world, the world anywhere. And I had the privilege of being the first person ever to work closely with them. There was a French scholar who published them. He was the one that did the amazing work of just...
Was that Lemire?
No, this was a guy named Daniel Arnaud, Arnaud.
Okay. Yeah, I'm familiar.
Lemire is an epigrapher who works on like alphabet texts.
Right. Okay.
So
Okay.
anyway, so I was the first one to work on these, and one of the things that I would notice as I began to read were points of comparison to biblical ritual, and that's where the Passover thing came.
Wow.
And because I'm also a biblical scholar, and this was the advantage of working both on the Bible very seriously. I'm not like an Assyriologist who dabbles in the Bible or a biblical scholar who dabbles in Assyriology. I'm one of the very few people in the world who works as a sort of primary professional specialty in both areas. Like I deeply in biblical studies and deeply in Assyriology. And so that was how I could even recognize the connection.
Right. Because someone probably, if someone had read it and didn't know the Bible, they wouldn't. They'd be like, "Oh, this is nice," and put it to the side.
Somebody would have spotted it eventually.
Yeah, eventually a Bible.
Got to be that person.
But thanks for being a Bible scholar, because if you weren't, it would have took us years to get it. But by the way, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about the book Time at Emar. Time at Emar. This was written about, I think, the year 2000. And this book talks in chapter 3, talks about the Zukru. Zukru, I pronounce it that way. I don't know if I pronounce it right.
I like that.
Okay. The Zukru, Zukru, the Zukru Festival. Years ago on Facebook, I was in a group and I told people about the information. They're like, you made that up. I said, you need to go read Time at Emar. And what it taught me was, if you're a Bible believer, it's kind of like, wow, how did they do this? And the same type of rituals. And then it even goes back further, because you found the word in the Mari text, I believe, that has to do with the same thing that is in Exodus. So it becomes now a linguistic thing, or a linguistic issue for you, because you found the words in the Mari text, which dates 1800 BC, way before we could imagine that there's an Exodus. So explain all of that and going through all of that, because as a Bible believer, I'd be very troubled. Like, what? 1800 BC? There's no Exodus then. So what's going on here? Explain it. Thank you.
I mean, the funny thing is that if people came along to the book of Exodus, the book of Deuteronomy, and they read about the Passover, which is a different word, it is interesting, by the way, with this word zukru. It's derived from a word for speaking or remembering, which is also in biblical Hebrew. And there's an offering that's called the zikaron in the Bible, in Hebrew, that is somehow either a memorial, or it's an offering where you pray at the same time, or you call on God at the same time. But the Passover itself, the Hebrew is Pesach, and the feast that's associated with it is called matzot, which is unleavened bread. And together, Passover and matzot make a 7-day or 8-day festival. And so some people could look at that and they'd say, well, I mean, we think that these biblical texts were written very, very late, after the time of Israel, maybe it's a description of early Jewish practice, but certainly not going back to Israel. So in a way, if you're a believer and you find out that at Emar in the 13th century, they were celebrating a festival at exactly the same time that is given as the calendar for the Passover in the Bible, it could tell you, well, so they weren't the only ones who had this festival calendar or ritual calendar, this event done at this time, but it means it's a very, very old idea, and that Israel could have been part of a culture where this would be the right time to have a major celebration of your most important God. And in fact, I mean, the people at Emar would have had a different god named Dagon, not Yahweh or El, and they would have had something particular to their own life to celebrate. But it would have been tapping into the same idea that if you want to remember and celebrate the most important God in your among your community, your people, that this is the time to do it, and that you should do it with a 7-day festival. It's a good question for a person of faith, whether they'd hear that and think, oh no, it's all over. It can't be the word of God. Or whether they'd think, great, like it can be the word of God, because that means that the people of Israel are described as also doing something very ancient that I now find confirmation of in this other, evidence. So I leave it to you and your audience to decide.
Yeah. On page 132, I think between 132 and 133, you talk about the Akitu, the Hittite festivals, and the Emar Zukru.
Yeah.
Now, just seeing that, it makes me look at the confederacy even deeper, because of course we find different traditions from different cultures. Deuteronomy have like a Hittite type of thing to it, the writing style. You see the Esarhaddon Treaty in Deuteronomy 28 and Deuteronomy 13. You see Hittite ways, you see the Babylonian, Mesopotamian stories, you see Egyptians, a little Egyptian sprinklings here and there. So it seems like Israelites is basically a confederacy of different people from different cultures and an admixture, and the story writers basically just added on to it just to add more. It's like you having an ice cream with different flavors.
Let me,
Yeah.
yes and no. So let me take it on. So first of all, it kind of depends on how you think about history or people. You could it'd be interesting to try to spin this out today, like identities today. And like, does it mean that because the community, like, I don't know, like if you picked an African-American community, this is probably going to get way wrong, but in New York City, in the Bronx or something like that, and you said, okay, like here you are, but you're in New York. And you're in the year, like, what year is it anymore?
2021.
I forget. It's the COVID is killing us. And so, but you're in New York, like you're all alike, right? I mean, everybody can be on the same media. And so you're really all the same. And yet, like, there are so many unique communities and mixes of communities and communities in contact with each other in New York City today.
Mm-hmm.
So that in some ways you could say that all New Yorkers, share certain things, the subway, at least when there's no COVID. And I mean, I'm exaggerating, right? And yet there can be all sorts of very particular communities within the city that are absolutely unique, and it's fair to think of them that way. So I would approach Israel of the Bible that way as well, and give it its uniqueness. Like, don't try to say, oh, well, they're all just flavors of the same thing. I mean, in a way, like if you want to say they're all New Yorkers, they're all like Middle Easterners from a certain time. And yeah, they're connected and they do certain stuff that's really similar because they're living in the same time, in the same kind of general space. And yet there are things that are really different about them. So this is the way I'm approaching it. Then if I go to your specific question, I'll sort of distinguish two things. And this will give you an example of what I mean about being both kind of like each other in some ways, but also really different in other ways. Right. So when I talked about the Akitu festival and these Hittite festivals, right, I was talking about the very particular practice. So I was not talking about the calendar, which was the connection with the Passover. Right. Talking about the fact that the way they celebrate this festival, which is quite interesting, is that they take the most important god of the city, whose name is Dagon, and they bring him out. Like, they must have been a statue, or I don't know, it's a little one or a big one, and they put it on a cart and they actually cart it outside. He has a temple somewhere in the city and he goes through the streets. You can picture maybe like a parade, probably people lining the streets watching. And they go out through the main city gates, and then they have the celebration outside the city. And all the people come out too, and they bring out all the other gods too. Maybe not on carts, but all the other gods come out. Like, everybody empties out the city because there's not enough space inside the city. Imagine some really old crowded place, right? And there and outside you can bring everybody, and everybody has this huge feast and they make all these sacrifices. And in fact, this is something I discovered, this is what you were reading, that is shared across the much wider Middle East. And they do it as part of this thing called the Akitu festival in Babylon and Assyria. They do something similar with different names in ancient Turkey, which is where the Hittites were. And here in Syria, we find them doing the same kind of thing. And so in the Bible, I also make a connection in another thing that I've written with the story in 2 Samuel chapter 6 of King David bringing the ark from outside the city into Jerusalem. And what I observed is that even though that's a story of how the ark got into the Jerusalem temple, in a way, it's sharing the same tradition as the Zakru from Emar, the Akitu from Babylon, and the others, that you bring the God into the city from outside. And in this case, the ark represents God. And so the thing then that I want you to notice is that that practice of bringing a God outside the city and bringing the God back in and celebrating the lordship of that God over the city is something that even Jerusalem could share with Emar and could share with Babylon. But if you go back to the Passover thing and the calendar, when you compare, we actually know exactly, because of how precise the Babylonians were in recording calendars, we know when they celebrated their Akitu festival, and they did it at the new moon. Like they had a calendar like the modern Islam, where the months follow the actual cycle of the moon. So you have a new month every time you have a new moon. And so the full moon is halfway through the month. So you start with nothing, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then you have the full thing. And that's full moon, it's the middle of the month, and then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and that month is to an end. The Babylonians celebrated this event at the beginning of a moon, so at the beginning of a month. But the thing that was amazing about Emar is that they celebrate it at the full moon. They start the festival when the moon is full, just like Israel in the Bible. And in fact, those, even now to this day, the only comparison that I have ever seen to that calendar, where you have the most important celebration of the most important God, and you do it at the full moon of the first month of the year. The only comparison for the Bible in Israel is Emar, the only one. And that's why Richard Hess told you about it. Wow. Again, I hope not, transgressing by, I guess because I'm talking to you and you're talking to a community that is in New York and a particular slice of New York. If I say, like, can you and your community, which itself is probably diverse in who knows how many ways, but say, like, we're not the same as all New Yorkers. We have our own sort of circle and our own life that we share in some ways. It's different from, other parts of New York. And so there's some way, and then even then, this is interesting because you would think, well, if it's Israel, Israel's different, they should be the only ones doing this. Mm-hmm. In fact, there are some other people who are clearly sharing that. Even though it's not like, oh, well, it's everybody's doing it. There are layers of differentness. And I bet if you go back to New York City, you could say the same thing. You could find layers of being different. And the smaller you draw the circle, you could find people who are more and more like your community, like in more and more things that you really share. So,
one of the things, and by the way, ladies and gentlemen, that conversation, that whole Zukru festival at Keto Hittites is from his book, Time at Emar. You have to get that book. You have to. All
My
right.
wife is laughing in the background.
Yeah, you have to. I'm telling you. Tell you why. Your
Tell
wife
your
sleepless
friends.
nights. Sleepless nights. Oh man. I'm gonna move forward to the book that I listen. This book I paraphrase it all the time. It's called The Legacy of Israel in Judah's Bible: History, Politics, and the Reinscribing of Tradition. Let me give you guys a scenario real quickly. The Song of Deborah we spoke about at the beginning of the show talks about a couple of tribes. We don't see these tribes. If the Song of Deborah is written in the 11th century BC, we don't see a lot of the tribes in that story, in the story that's written later on from a Judean Deuteronomic point of view. You have 12 tribes, but the same 12 tribes are not in the story that's in the Song of Deborah. All right, that's a blunt way of putting it. The reason for this family is because Israel at the 11th century BC time period is not the same Israel as we would see it from a Deuteronomic Judean point of view. In fact, Dr. Fleming, you could correct me. The archaeology for Judea, the land itself, it wasn't as populated as other areas we would call in the northern regions. It wasn't as populated until around the ninth, 8th century BC, a lot because of the trade. I think it was not spice. There's a specific thing I heard Philip Davies talk about. There's a specific trade they
Maybe
had.
frankincense.
Frankincense, right, and a couple other
So
things.
just by the way, Philip Davies passed away
Yes, yes.
a year ago, but I knew him.
Mm-hmm.
Was he loved starting a fight? Like he was, but he was such a great guy. Like I'm just that.
All right.
Thumbs up to Philip Davies, even if we wouldn't have agreed on all things. He was the one.
Right. But my point is that I'm trying to say is this book, The Legacy of Israel in Judah's Bible. Why is he calling it in Judah's Bible? He's going to explain everything to you guys. Go ahead, my brother.
Okay, let me try two angles. So for one, there's the Judah's Bible part, and then just listening to you talk a little bit about Israel. I'll try to give you a quick sketch of how I think about the name Israel. So when I say Judah's Bible, and I guess it's finally the legacy of Israel in Judah's Bible, I kept changing the name back and forth. It was always going to be the legacy of Israel in Jay's Bible, but the other choice would have been in a Jewish Bible. And I said before that all the names associated with Judaism, with being Jewish, derive from the word Judah, which in Hebrew is Yehudah. And that name was the name of the kingdom that had Jerusalem as its capital in the 8th and 7th and beginning of the 6th century, before it was destroyed by the Babylonians and brought to an end. And even then, a lot of the people were still there. It became a province of the various empires, all the way down to the time of Jesus under the Romans. It was still called Judea, which took its name from the same name, the same kingdom. And so when Christians decided, amazingly to me, that the Bible should have two parts, that it should not just be the stories about and sayings of Jesus and the writings of Paul and other early church leaders. Like you think, why not have that be your Bible? Like, here's your teaching, that should be your Bible. It's way simpler. You don't have to get tangled up in this really old stuff. But in fact, Jesus had a Bible himself. Like and his people, he said, no, we know what the Bible is. We know what the word of God is. We know what our authority is. He said, I am not breaking this. I am fulfilling it. And that Bible was the Jewish Bible. Like Jesus was Jewish, Paul was Jewish, all the first Christians were Jewish. And so Jesus, the reason that the Christians have an Old Testament is that it was unimaginable to have a Bible without it. And so you could only have a Bible in two parts. that you could have a New Testament, so you could have Jesus and Paul and everything, but you could not begin to have a Bible without what became the Old Testament. And that Old Testament is the Jewish Bible. That's why it is, and as a Jewish Bible, by using the term Judah in my title, The Legacy of Israel and Judah's Bible, I'm saying that what is so interesting about having, the Bible of the Jewish people be about the people of Israel is that there are these two names. And the Bible doesn't, now I'm using the term the way my Hebrew and Judaic Studies department does, which is it's just the Old Testament. So the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible, does not, eventually you can get the name Judah and the name Israel used as if they just mean the same thing. But if you go back through the story that it tells from Genesis through the book of Kings, they're not the same thing. Like Judah is one kingdom, and there's the larger kingdom to the north called Israel. And sometimes they even talk as if the two together might be part of something larger called Israel, but they're quite separate. And then if you go back to the book of Joshua, say, where you have the 12 tribes, Judah is one of the tribes. And if you go to Genesis, then Judah is one of the sons of Jacob, with the other tribes also having an ancestor, each one as a son of Jacob. And so, in a way, what lies at the base of my book is the strangeness of the fact that the Jewish people would both embrace the name Israel. It's like, we are the heirs to the name Israel. Like Israel, we are Israel. We are what's left of Israel. And yet at the same time, their story says, but we're not all of Israel. Like that Israel was much bigger, and we're what's left. Now, so that's the Judah's Bible part. Like that, the reason it's called The Legacy of Israel and Judah's Bible is trying to find out what the name Israel is doing in a Bible that is Jewish and that is the heritage of the Jewish people, meaning the survivors of the kingdom of Judah in particular. And how is it that the name Israel and the stories about Israel and the very particular ideas about Israel would have been preserved and loved and guarded by the people of Judah and brought into the center of their Bible, their scripture. So the other part of what you were saying to introduce has to do with then the name Israel itself. And the thing that I would underscore here, and this is where and I think especially of my colleague Lauren Monroe that I keep mentioning, together we've been working very much on names in the Bible as they may relate to history. And the problem is that the Bible has a whole story for Israel. It tells you, it even would say that they're a family, that you can explain the entire people of Israel as going back to a family of a guy named Jacob and all his sons, and then their kids and so on. And you can explain it all by that. And it can say that they lived in the land, and then they went to Egypt because of a famine, and then they got stuck in Egypt and they had to escape with an exodus. And they lived in the land again for a while without kings. And then they had kings, and then they split into two. That's the whole story, that they get taken over by empires and became the Jewish people. But the problem is that in writing this set of books that became the Old Testament or the Jewish Bible, they had to pull together all their sources and all their memories, and they had to make them fit and try to make it make sense together. And the notion that there were 12 tribes and that they all belonged together as sons of one ancestor named Jacob may be a fairly late part of that process. It's an argument. And so I, for one, but also Lauren Monroe, among other people, and in a way, Andrew Tobolowsky also, that he was interested in that kind of problem. what do you do then with all these biblical names? If they all have to be attributed to the latest possible date of biblical writing, so that the Bible is all written all at once, it would make them historically pretty irrelevant, because it would be too late to know much about the Iron Age when Israel existed in the land. So out of the Bible, what parts of the Bible might go back to the Iron Age, go back to a time when the names really meant something, on the ground. And so this book was an effort to unravel that. So in the Bible, if you approach it as an historian, what could you find out? What could you find out about the name Israel itself? What could you find out about the names of tribes? What can you find out about the name of Judah, which is the name of the kingdom? And so one way or another through that book, I try to account for pretty much all the kinds of evidence in the Bible, if not every little piece of it, that would speak to history, and especially speak to the time when something called Israel really existed in the land. And this then ends up being in dialogue with archaeology, because archaeologists would say, we're the ones who know what's there. Like they have excavated every time in every place, which is why somebody can say that for the south, which is where Judah was, that there just weren't very many people if you go back to the early Iron Age. And this seems to be true. The problem is that for that period, we have no texts, 0, 0, 0, like not one text between, the around 1200, maybe a little after, when the Egyptians were still there, to, the 9th century, pretty much, when, you get Mesha. So for, 300 years, we have nothing in writing from the area of Israel, even the largest Israel you could imagine, except the Bible to give names. And so, in fact, for your interest, this is an advertisement, at least just for you, if not your listeners. There's a fairly new journal called Hebrew Bible and Ancient Israel. I don't know if you've heard it, but you should look for it. Again, it's called Hebrew Bible and Ancient Israel.
It's an article?
It's a journal. So
journal. Okay.
Each volume is a small book with collected articles.
Okay.
And so each one comes out with a single editor or a couple of editors and is on a single topic. It's been around for about 10 years. And Lauren Monroe and I have just finished editing a volume of this. It's not out yet. And it's going to be on the name Israel. I wrote an article on what I call Little Israel, which is the older Israel. She wrote an article on what's called Greater Israel, which is first the kingdom of the 9th century, and then what happened to that kind of conception as you go down a little bit from there in time.
Right.
And a wonderful archaeologist, an Israeli archaeologist named Aaron Meyer, wrote a third article on the way he would approach the problem of the name Israel from an archaeologist's point of view. And so those 3 articles will be a great kind of overview of the whole problem of naming, but particularly focused on the name Israel.
Okay. All right. So that whole commentary, family, was from about the legacy of Israel in Judah's Bible, which is very interesting. Let me ask you, I'm going to close your book out for here. So we talked about the legacy of Israel in Judah's Bible. We talk about Yahweh before Israel, time at Emar, 3 books. I don't know. I haven't read any other book from you. I just got to be honest. Nope, I haven't. I'm not even going to go there.
You got an impressive record.
Those 3 alone.
3 of my books.
Okay. Let me ask you about the Exodus. You talked about what's a proposition, and the proposition sometimes doesn't match up with the archaeological record. What do you say about the Exodus on a whole, from Professor Dr. Daniel Fleming's perspective.
Yeah, my wife is laughing in the background again. She hears your every word. So what? So I guess let's say there's three sort of angles here, just in order to frame out a response. One is archaeology and non-biblical evidence, right? So you have to and I teach a class on this to undergraduates even, and so I have to think with them about how to get their mind around what the problem looks like to an historian. And it doesn't matter whether you have faith or not faith, you believe in God or not, what you think of the Bible exactly. If you're an historian, you have to go with the evidence and work with what you've got. And so in this kind of case, because the Bible is a special kind of source, and even when I told you that this new journal volume that Lauren Monroe and I have edited is going to be really useful and important for your interest, I think. This is, the purpose in the two of us writing what we wrote is to help people figure out what from the Bible actually can help put together a historical picture in conversation with archaeologists. If you set aside the Bible as a special kind of source because it's layered in the way it was put together, the wonderful reason that it even exists is because it was preserved for communities of faith, or the Jewish community, for everything that's connected with God and its identity. And yet, if you think the actual copy of the Bible, what's the oldest copy of the Bible? I mean, you could say there's fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are from Roman times. They're from the time of Jesus, more or less, the oldest copies. And that's already hundreds of years after the very end of what it's describing. Whereas if you ask about Egyptian monuments, like you said, what's the oldest reference to the name Yahweh? And I said, oh, it's from this temple in the early 14th century. It's really from the early 14th century. Like, this is not a copy of a copy or something like that. Like, the actual object is that old. It's 3,400 years old. This is not true for the Bible, right? So it's just to say that when you ask about the Exodus, even though the question is about the Bible, but if you ask it about history, which is kind of your question, like, what do you think? You kind of have to say, yeah, it's a Bible question, but let's just recognize, first of all, that the Bible is a special kind of source because its oldest copy is so much later than the events it describes, and it's layered, and it's a combination of all sorts of writing and rewriting. It's just a different kind of book. So what else is there? And you could say, I mean, there might be archaeology and there might be texts. So what would you expect? Like, would you expect, I mean, at least one thing that's kind of cool is that if they were in Egypt and they escaped from Egypt, you think, all right, Egyptians had writing at that time. In fact, no matter when exactly you date the end Exodus, whether it's an earlier date or a later date, and people argue about that, who at least are, want to argue that it existed. And it doesn't matter whether you say it's earlier or later. There were Egyptians with kings and writing and monuments all through, and they never say a word about it. So then what? Does that mean it couldn't have happened? Well, maybe not. Like, I mean, in fact, I think it doesn't say that it couldn't have happened, but it means that we don't have any confirmation. So then you could say, well, okay, how about the people? Like, would there be Israelites in Egypt? And maybe texts from Egypt, which were there, we know they were there, and they describe all sorts of things. Like, the reason I could write my book on Yahweh before Israel was because back in 1380, and then later in like 1250 or something like that, Egyptian kings were so proud of what they had conquered, or at least how powerful they thought they were, that on their temples, they would write a kind of map of the world they knew. And they would draw pictures of prisoners who had their hands tied behind their backs and who were bent over in submission. And they would draw these things around their temples and put their names of the map of the world on top of every one of them. And that's where that Yahweh name was, on one of those prisoners. So you think, okay, they definitely could have Israel. And there is a reference to Israel in this one Egyptian text from about 1200. But that Israel is not in Egypt. It's an enemy that they fought and defeated in the land. So this is sort of problem number 2, like when it comes to what there is outside the Bible. That there's no reference to an Exodus, but there's also no reference to anybody named Israel in the land who could escape. And so then people have argued, well, maybe some other name is actually the same people. But I mean, if it was the name Jacob, or it was the name Joseph, or if it was the name of some other tribe, or like those names, they just aren't there. And so it's just to say then that there's nobody identified that could be the people who would escape. Now that still doesn't prove that it didn't happen, because I mean, why would the particular names have found their way into the Egyptian text? Like the Egyptians barely had any idea of what the Yahweh people were. They just happened in one text inscribed on one temple way up the Nile River in Sudan. They happened to have this from some record somewhere. They got the name that turns out to have been like the big name of the people, you know, the God that the people worshiped in the Bible. So I'm not actually putting this out there to say the Exodus couldn't have happened. I'm saying that if it happened, if there was something like a real Exodus, it would have involved people who were going by names that either weren't known to the Egyptians, or they didn't care, they didn't record them. It would have had to be on a scale that, like, you can't picture that it was something where one of the pharaohs was killed because he was crossing the Red Sea and he drowned in it. Because we actually have the bodies of like every pharaoh, right? We have the actual mummies of every pharaoh, all the way from the earliest date you could put the Exodus through. And interestingly, recent studies have like looked at their DNA, and they figured out what diseases they had, and which one had bad teeth, and you know, like which one had gout, or you know, syphilis, or like, I mean, it's just to say, like, there are certain things you could know. And yet, like, so then you can go to the other side. You go to the side of where they went. They ended up in what became Israel. And I told you, like, there, except for this one reference to Israel in an Egyptian text, just in passing, where they say they defeated somebody named Israel. That's the only text until the 9th century when we would have any reference at all. Actually, I have to bracket that there's an Egyptian king from about 920, so slightly earlier, who
Dr. Fleming
actually who wrote an account of like towns that he conquered when he went through. But that's right. It.
That's during the Solomon David time. But let me ask you this question: during the Merneptah stele, right, where Israel is mentioned.
Yeah.
At that time, if there is, as you might call it, a little Israel, it definitely goes against the biblical narrative. Even if the Exodus had happened, it according to the narrative, they have basically taken over, whether by force or not, that they would have, been in control. But even after the Merneptah stele, you find Egyptians. If you look at Eric Klein's information, he's still talking about some sort of rule after Ramesses III. So I'm trying to figure out, there's some areas where they defeated some people, and they're defeating these people, and they say, oh, they no longer exist. That's fine. People exaggerate, just like the Misha Steele. If I'm writing my history years from now, or somebody, I hope they say I conquered, I slapped, I had a fight with Donald Trump and beat him up, 5 times while he was president. I hope somebody writes that. So I understand the gross exaggeration, the hyperboles, but it doesn't match up even with the Bible. Because that I don't think that's a good reference for the Bible thumpers, though. I don't think it is.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, this is where the layeredness of the Bible is part of the picture. And again, I mean, these books that I've written, you're a brave man. That I just admire your drive and your curiosity. Like you want to know, and you want to read reading people who really know instead of just reading second and third and fourth hand.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
No, I'm really serious about that because, the time at Emar, I really wrote for specialists. So I did try to make it as understandable as possible. The other two books that are on Israel and Yahweh, the problem is I was making arguments that even among scholars have not been settled, and I needed to persuade the specialists. But I really wanted to write something that somebody like you could read. And I'm so happy to know that you've taken it on. And so if other people who listen to you try it, then, be forewarned. I mean, I'm trying to prove arguments even that will hold up with other scholars, even though I did try to write in the most accessible way I could. This is going back to, Marin Ptah. The thing is that, well, in a way, my response to your whole question is that book, The Legacy of Israel and Judah's Bible. So if somebody really wants to see what I think overall, they really need to try to take on that book. I guess the way I would put it together is that given that archaeology doesn't come with names, there are a couple of Egyptian texts that make a name connection. There's this one it used to be called Merneptah, but Egyptologists now think it's Meren Ptah. Ptah is the name of the god. That's from 1207. That's the old reference to Israel. Then there are these two temples that have the reference to Yahweh, but I mean, that's almost it in terms of names that connect with the Bible directly. And especially the people of God in the Bible, or the people of Israel. So then there's archaeology, and it's got tons of information, but it doesn't come with names. Like, how do you know who's who? Like, you're digging stuff. You dig a city, you dig a village, but who are they? And how do they relate to each other from one site to another site? In a way, you're dependent on texts for the answer to that. And there aren't enough texts until you get to the Bible. And so in a way, to come back to your Exodus question, I say, okay, like even the Bible stories about the Exodus are layered, that there are people adding to stories and trying to connect, like the story about coming out of Egypt. There's really two of them, by the way. I don't know if you noticed this, that are quite separate. One is the story of the plagues that they were trying to escape, and the Egyptians wouldn't let them. And so God intervened. Instead of just saying, oh, I'm going to bring you out right now, he said, I'm going to show them by having these disasters happen one after the other, and then I'm going to bring you out. And so this is a story almost all in itself. And then there's a separate story of crossing the Red Sea. And it even has a poem about it, which is in Exodus chapter 15, that's usually called the Song of the Sea. And if you read that poem, you would not know actually even that the story of the Exodus had happened. It's quite separate, just like the Song of Deborah. And so you have these two stories that Bible writers have joined. Like, okay, if there was a story of Egypt being defeated by drowning in the sea, that must go with the coming out of Egypt with the plague story. So they put them together in one story. But then there's the story, like, how did Israel get in the land? Like, actually get in the land. And they have separate stories about that, which are what's left of them, at least, are in the book of Joshua. And those have now been combined, like all into one. So when you say, if you're a Bible believer, this should be a problem, like, or at least the reference to Israel doesn't just fit and confirm this. True. All it says is that somebody called Israel is somewhere in the land in 1207. It doesn't say that those people were ever in Egypt. So, the question though is, if you let the different parts of the story speak for themselves before they had been combined, how do those sound? And this is something that I've tried to do. I'm not the only scholar who's tried to work this way. And so from that point of view, the Exodus story has to be measured on its own. Like it's when I say Exodus story, I'm not necessarily saying, oh, it's also a story about crossing the sea and all these Egyptians drowning. It's not necessarily about entering the promised land with Joshua and crossing the Jordan River, or defeating the city of Jericho by walking around it 7 times and blowing trumpets. Or it's not assuming that the layer of biblical writing that said there were, over 1 million Israelites is, the Exodus story in itself doesn't need that many people. Like somebody later started counting and they came up with all these numbers, and that makes it look way bigger. So I guess the thing that I find intriguing that needs some kind of explanation is the notion that people who could be identified with Israel had been captive to Israel and actually in Israel. Captive to Egypt. People who identified as Israel were captive to Egypt and actually in Egypt at some early time. And this is just a strange thing to say. There's this wonderful scholar who was the biblical scholar at Harvard named Peter Machinist. Maybe you've heard his name. He just retired. And he wrote an article that was partly devoted to observing this, that this is a strange story for a people who lived in this land to tell about itself. That we're not native to the land. We had to invade it. We come from outside. Because usually people in a given land like to claim they were there forever. Like our God was here, our God created us here. The Egyptians say that about Egypt. Like they say, we were always here. Our gods were here. They birthed us here. It's weird to say we came over and we came from outside, we took over and we killed everybody. Like this is not a normal origin story. So
Hey, Doc,
I don't know.
Doc, you know what
just to say, I got
you know what just jumped in my head? You know what though? I don't have to have an Exodus to have a Passover celebration. I don't have to. I don't have to, because I have the zoo crew to go by. I have all these festivals that
and
I don't need the Exodus. So if I was a traditional Hebrew or a Jewish person and we're doing the Haggadah, we're telling the stories, we don't need the story to have this festival. The ritual is very good. It's good for discipline. It's good. I like the rituals.
I think it is
very.
This is one that's hard to parse, but it's very possible that the earliest, or even likely that, at least I say, you're hearing me as a scholar talking, that the earliest version of the festival that the people of Israel celebrated at that time was not for the Exodus. The first version that we have in the Bible that puts the two together makes sense. But that itself may be some kind of combination of storylines. But even that, we can't know. Like there's just no. This is why I can be frustrating as a teacher, because I'll refuse to answer the direct question sometimes. Right. In this way, I'm trying to say, okay, Exodus in Bible. Then there's a world of texts, of archaeology around it that just don't give us enough information to decide. So we're left again with the Bible. The way I handle that is I try to separate the sort of simplest version of the text and the story from all the stuff it's been combined with. And then I think what it is. And then even then, you can't be sure like how the story began. So.
Well, at A.J. Crowley's translation of the Elephantine papyri, I think one of his conclusions is that they had a celebration for unleavened bread, but they weren't celebrating anything regarding an Exodus. He said it was just a tradition. I think that was his conclusion based off of what he read from all the documents from the Elephantine. So you might have a point. You might have a major point. It could be something. And if you read Rabbi Golinkin, he's from, I don't know if I pronounce his name right. He's from the Schechter Institute. He speaks about how the storytelling and certain rituals with Passover is connected to other cultures and was added later on. So there was always this in the Canaan region where you'd have like the Zuku festivals and people having agricultural stuff regarding the dates, the spring festivals. But as far as saying it's for what happened in the Exodus, that was possibly later on, because most scholars agree that the Judeans that went by the river Jordan are, the song by the rivers of Babylon. So they were the ones who constructed the storyline. Not saying there was no Exodus tradition, but the version that we have late was constructed by those Jews who said, hey, look what God did for us in the past. This is what he's going to do for us while we're in Babylon. So we got God on our side. So it was inspirational. And then it became this big storyline. And it goes back to your book, the Israel in Judah's Bible. Because, hey,
And I guess to me, it is, again, regardless of whether one's Jewish or Christian of some kind, or neither of the above, something else, I think that in order to understand the Bible rightly, that we need to let it be itself and to respect the work of the people who brought it to us. I mean, not just all the people who copied it, but especially during the period when it was being pulled together. And those people were trying to bring us the best of what they had and what they understood. And it took time. And those people were not working in the time of Moses, and they weren't even working in the time of David. Like the people who actually brought us the Bible probably go back to the time of the two kingdoms, I call it, when there were two kingdoms, Israel and Judah, the 9th and the 8th centuries. The work of kind of Bible writing and collecting began especially then, and continued after the kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians. And I think many of those people and their scribes came into Judah, many of them to Jerusalem, and worked together with learned people from Judah and Jerusalem, and together continued to put together their sort of text and to write new texts. The prophets are from that time, the Psalms are from that time and after. And the Bible kept growing. And then at a certain point, there was a sense, I mean, this is who we are. And they needed to kind of draw some lines around it to separate it from other writing. And that became their Bible. And so to me, to recognize the time and the effort that it took and the distance from their own actual origins. Like believers may want the Genesis to have been written by Jacob and sons, and they want Deuteronomy to be written by Moses, and they want Joshua to be written by Joshua. But I mean, the way the Bible actually seems to come into existence was that the actual writing of the Bible we had doesn't reflect people who were writing anything in those early years. It reflects people from the time of the two kingdoms, especially, who were trying to pull together stories of their past and to say, this is who we are. This is who our God is. This is how we should be. And then it's absolutely true that if you're Jewish or different varieties of Jewish, that's one thing. I mean, if you're Orthodox, then the Torah or the books of Moses have a particular standing that you just can't take apart. But in fact, I know Orthodox people who don't even believe in God, but who still think there's huge value in practicing the ritual. And there are a lot of different solutions, but I also know Orthodox people and Christians who believe that the Bible is layered and that it can still be inspired. Like God has given us a story about the people of God and the activity of God through time, where it's okay that the stories of time gone by, like Genesis, are kind of trying to make sense of the fog, right? going way back and thinking, who are we? Well, we're a family. Who is humanity? Like a family, like the picture of Genesis says, it's not just the people of Israel that are one family. All humanity is one family, which is a pretty wild and powerful idea. And it doesn't mean that you have to like confirm the genealogy that every single member of the people of Israel was related to some single person named Jacob. That's me on a rant.
That's fine. Before we get off the air, you made some very good points, and I want to say to your wife who's listening, thank you for putting up with Dr. Fleming all these years, and allowing him to do these great writings that he has done. And you are right, Time at Emar is not for the average reader. I'm not even gonna lie. I'm not even gonna lie. I'm not
Well,
gonna
if
say
you do lie and your listeners start reading it, they're going to come after you.
Well, they're gonna have to understand it first. But I do want to say thank you for taking out your time today for coming on and expressing some of the stuff you've learned over the years. You took your time to get your PhD, and you've developed into one of the greatest scholars of the common era, and your work is respected. And I respect your work, and I'm sure the audience, they look like they enjoyed your work a lot. And I would love to have a conversation again in the future down the line. It's up to you, time permitting. And I want to say thank you again for coming on. But before you leave, I do want to ask you this. Based on everything we have said today, it seems like the 12 tribes was more of a writing invention to tell a history of a people. Not that all of it is fiction or a myth or whatever, but they're trying to get a history written down. And because of the time period where it was, you had the Greeks coming in with Herodotus, his writings. You had before him Hectaeus, Meletius. You had different people trying to put a chronological, synchronistic writings together. You had the Assyrians writing. You had the Persians, although most of the Persians have been destroyed. But it seems like this was their version. And in a sense, they lived as a kingdom within the realm of an empire as a vassal. So they really weren't as powerful as the book says, but they made themselves as powerful as an empire. What do you think about that?
I mean, there's kind of two parts. One is the 12 tribe part, and the other is the powerful as an empire part. And I really liked what you said about the 12 tribes, which is that these are not just made up in any way, but putting them together the way they are put together is a way of writing their history, which is something close to what you said. And a way to think about it goes back to the Song of Deborah, Judges 5, which we talked about quite a bit, in that the core battle account of that poem has the names of 10 different groups, if I'm remembering the number right, that made up the people of Yahweh. And then the introduction to the poem kind of, in my view, reinterprets that as Israel. And of those 10 groups, 8 of them are actual tribes in the 12 tribe list. So that's a lot. So this is a text that might come from the 11th century. And 2/3 of the actual listed tribes, or something like that, are named as allies who fight together under the name of Yahweh in that poem. And somebody came along and said, yeah, this is Israel. I think it was under the time of the kings. So it's just to say that already in the 9th century, somebody was taking a lot of those tribes and saying, yeah, we're Israel. We're the tribes of Israel. And they were taking a text that was even older that had those same groups, and they were allies, but just not under the name Israel. I'm saying they were under the name the people of Yahweh. That's a lot of ancient history that is built into the picture of 12 tribes. This is not made up. And that is not the only biblical text. Like there are other texts about tribes and with these names. And some of these stories are very old and based on people that were really there. But they had to figure out, like, how do they relate and how do they unify as one people? And how can we remember ourselves as connected to that people? And so there's a tendency to want to unify it and simplify it away. And then the other side of what you said is that there's also in a way, because if you want to glorify the power of your God, to say, look, I mean, this God was not just operating with some small time group. It was successful in its day. In fact, in a way, it's amazing that the Jewish people wrote and imagined such a powerful God. They wrote such a powerful story, given that they were defeated and subservient to empires one after another for hundreds of years before even the time of Jesus. And yet, even with that experience as downtrodden people, they could believe that their God was more powerful than the most powerful empire that ruled them. And they were not just, kidding themselves. They knew what oppression was like century after century, and they still believed it. And they didn't believe it because their God always won, like made them rule the world. They believed it because they believed in the kind of God who could control everything, even when it seemed like you lost. And so yeah, they had to say, well, I mean, before we were defeated and went into exile and were oppressed in our own land and were under empires for ages and ages, we did have our day. Like we really were kingdoms, and we all came into our land and we ruled our own place. And we had a king named David who was a great king, and that's as close as you come to saying we were pretty strong. Though, even then, David is never said to be as strong as the Assyrians or the Babylonians or something like that. He's just supposed to have been like a really successful king that nobody could defeat. So, I'm with you on the idea of kind of glorifying the success of the people, although it's remarkable how much the story of the Bible just kind of checks that and says, okay, yep, we had our day, but overall, if you want to remember one thing about us, it's that we were defeated. But we have the greatest God ever anyway.
Exactly. Wow. I always tease some folks and say, you know what? Why would you like a God that constantly punishes you? We are the people that followed the laws that the God blessed. And in history, they're always being oppressed and somehow, I don't know, that's a whole nother religion. I don't want to go there. But let me answer this last question.
That's the Bible's religion.
Yeah, that's the Bible stuff. I don't want to go there. I got my brother Reggie Mabry in the audience. He wants to ask, what is more important for humanity, truth or belief? Hold on a second. I'm sorry. I think I got the question wrong. Hold on 1 second. Do we respect truth or beliefs? What is the value of truth in history?
Yeah. I mean, so
your wife liked that one, right?
You haven't, well, one thing, you haven't asked me about my own belief.
So no.
And I won't go there.
On purpose. I do that on purpose with everybody. I know what Dr. Hess believes, but I refuse to ask him the whole time because we're talking about archaeology and history. So I don't want the audience to know what you believe. That's your personal belief.
I'll keep it that way. But I guess the reason that I even think of it is that if I were to believe anything, and now I won't even think of it just in terms of God or a faith or religion, but if I want to believe what I read on the news, I mean, in fact, whatever, this is political and maybe delicate, but the last election was in some ways about belief. And when you read polls right now about what people think happened in the November election, there are people who believe that Donald Trump won and the election was stolen by people fiddling with the voting count in various states. And in a way, you could say, okay, there's truth and there's belief. And so I guess in a way, to me, it's a demonstration of what can happen when belief is completely untethered from truth. when it's disconnected. And so I would like for anything that I believe, for it to be attached to truth. Now, there are all sorts of things that we can't know for sure, where there are choices to make. When it comes to God, there are so many aspects of that question that go beyond what can be measured, what evidence and argument can prove or disprove. There are parts of it that absolutely you could argue on the basis of evidence, and you can have those arguments. But to answer his question, I think that it's hard to talk about truth in a way that excludes belief. You know, that if belief means commitments in a way, like commitments to act, to behave in a certain way, and yet to have belief and to disconnect it from truth and to say, oh, I just believe this. Can't you respect that I believe it? Well, I mean, belief that is completely disconnected from truth. Number one, it makes it hard to talk to other people who don't believe the same things as you. Like, I think the truth is the basis for conversation. It's the basis to communicate and to actually get to know somebody else, like who has a different experience from you, but there's something you can hold in common, and that'll be truth. And so to me, when belief becomes completely unconnected, it can be destructive, and it separates people.
Yes, it does.
Not to say that you can't, that's not to deny the belief. I myself look for a connection to truth.
Okay. All right. Let me see if there's any more questions from the audience. Well, pretty much we've done almost over 2 hours, so we did a lot of time. It's surprising.
You let it keep going. I don't know.
I know. All right. So thank you for coming on, Dr. Fleming. I did get in contact with Brother Zevi Bendor Bennett.
Oh,
the Lost Tribes of Israel.
So tell him, give him my very best. He is a wonderful person and just a fun person to listen to. So
I'm sure he is. I mean,
talk to him. He's going to be all over this. Like his field is not the ancient stuff, and his field is broader global history.
Right.
But he's one of these Israelis who's interested in everything. And I say Israelis because I know some people like him who just love their own ancient history. It's their land. And so they know the archaeology, they know the Bible, they ask really deep questions about the stuff. So you'll be able to ask him about everything from the old stuff to but when it comes to like what happened with this Lost Tribes of Israel thing, he's run down every version of that you could imagine. Even to when I read his book, I couldn't believe some of the people and places who said we're the lost tribes. So
wow. All right.
Hey,
Dr. Fleming, I salute you. Great job. The audience is loving you, and I will definitely be in contact if I have any questions or something within your area of expertise.
Sure. Stay in touch. It was really a pleasure. And I mean, I have no idea who's listening to you, but even just to talk to you.
We have 200 people live watching, 200 people watching right now. Mm-hmm.
But for anybody else who's watching or listening, then you should realize that Garfield, that this is an amazing person to take on trying to read scholarship by the people who are doing the research themselves. It's a real challenge to do. And, you know, even students in the field would not find it easy. So, and also for me as I write, like just for me to know that you individually took on these books and thought about them, that's a great thing for me to hear. So.
Thank you. Definitely. And they're all worth the read, even time at Emar, which. Oh, before you go, hold on. Let me ask you this. The calendar that the Jews use today is not the calendar from.
I know.
Right.
This is another one of the examples of when I say that the Bible is a collection and it's layered, like that statement, the reason it may, for your hearers, they may think, why is he saying this? Why is it so important? And it's because the Bible has so many different voices preserved in it. And some, like you have to tune some out in order to listen to the one at a time. So the finished biblical calendar and Jewish calendar. In fact, if you know Jewish people who are celebrating Passover or Sukkot, the Feast of Booths, I mean, they are following the biblical calendar that is, on one hand, biblical, but it's Babylonian. Like it does, this calendar does reflect the conquest of the Babylonian kingdom in the early 500s BCE. And they give it numbers in the Bible, but in fact, the Jewish names are derived from the Akkadian language. Like they are the names that were known from Babylon itself. And if you go back to there's more than one text that does this, but to the earliest biblical descriptions of the festivals, or you just say there are different descriptions in the Bible of these festivals, like Passover, they don't share the same calendar. And so indeed, like the Zukru calendar from Emar is not the Babylonian calendar. Like it doesn't have the same month names, it doesn't have the same festivals. And so when I say that that the biblical calendar matches, it's a kind of hybrid, like it's a combination of a much older calendar, but with a sort of Babylonian framework that they added on, and it's still the Jewish calendar.
All right. Thank you,
You
Dr.
asked.
I salute you, my brother. All right.
Also,
take care. And
yeah, stay in touch.
I will definitely reach out soon.
Okay. Nice to meet you.
Same here, my brother.
Okay.
All right, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm out of here. Bye.
All right. Take care. I'll be back on at 5 p.m. Eastern with Tim O'Neill. Black Line. If you want to step up in the line, it's then. And come take on Tim O'Neill tonight. This is your chance, bro. We're going to talk about Jesus. We're going to talk about decade by decade. We're going to talk about the history of Christianity. He's all the way in Australia. It's going to be 9 a.m., 5 p.m. Eastern. Come on, man. Get your questions together. Ask Brother Garfield at gmail.com. And family, when you're watching the show, don't get into a debate with people, man. Everybody going to have their opinion. If somebody disrespectful, just kick them out the chat. Those guys, they're crazies. We don't need crazies over here. We need people who want to listen and advance where they at, because nobody has all the answers. All the answers. I don't know what he believes, and I don't want him to tell us what he believes, because obviously, if he does have a belief, it's not affecting his research. So I don't want to know what he believes. I don't care. I just want the information he's teaching to come to the people. You draw your conclusion. And Black Lion, I got all of that for you, brother. All right, I got all of that for you. I hope you guys learned something. Take your notes, get the books, do what you do. We be back on in 2.5 hours with Tim O'Neill. And if Black Lion ain't punking out, if he don't punk out, then you know what it is. Anonymous Hebrew, what up? What up? What up, dude? Courtney, what's up? What's up, Shaz? Thanks for the support. If y'all want to hit up the Cash App, Brother Garfield for you. Brother Garfield, the number for you. All right. Peace and love, family. Hey. If I wasn't prepared, some of these interviews, I got to write down notes and all that stuff. Some of them, I pretty much know their works. So, and a lot of people in our community don't know a Dr. Daniel Fleming. They don't know a Dr. Richard Hess. They don't know a Robert. Well, some of them know Robert Schorsch. They know Tudor Parfit. They know Richard Carrier, David Fitzgerald. But Tim O'Neill is kind of different. All right. I want to say thank you for supporting the channel and watching this live. I hope you guys took from it, and I hope it gets you to another level. All right. Dr. Joshua Bowen, another interview from last Friday. That was pretty good. All right. So we got Scholar number 11 coming up at 5 p.m. Eastern. Much love, much respect for supporting the channel and watching. and I'm out. Peace.